So a fantastic video just to remind us about what skills is all about and the diversity of it, and just how wonderful some of the young people we have in our colleges up and down the country. So just to welcome to the stage, we've got Paul Novak, Deputy General Secretary of the TUC, John Cope, who's Head of Skills at CBI, Cindy Ramboso, who many of you will know, Senior Vice President, BTEC and Apprenticeships from Pearson, and John Guthrie, the Employment and Policy Advisor from UK Hospitality. So we've got a session now where each of the panel are going to spend a few minutes just talking around the issue. There's plenty to talk about. I suspect hospitality and Brexit might come up at some point. I suspect there'll be some complaints about colleges not quite getting industry, John, perhaps. You know, I think there will be all sorts of opportunities that unions offer us. And Cindy's got fantastic experience working across the country with hundreds of colleges over many years. So we're going to start, I think, with John Cope to say a few words. John.
Thank you so much, David. Well, it's fantastic to be here and to speak on a sort of employer view. And not only that, to sort of reflect on the 40 colleges or so and 80 universities that are actually CBI members. So the CBI itself is sort of a microcosm of this partnership between education and business. Any conversation you have with employers, you'll soon get onto the topic of education and skills. It's not only the #1 driver of productivity, but it's also essential social justice and a fairer society. Two things that, in my experience, business values equally. So I wanted to talk today a little bit about the UK skills picture, and where better to look than the CBI annual survey of its members on education and skills that we do in partnership with Pearson. This year's represents about 28,000 employers, so a really good sense check of what's going on. And there are a few messages that jumped out to me that were important for today's conversation. First, an optimistic note. Employers, those surveyed, actually predict that they will be taking on more people over the next 5 to 10 years at a higher level of skills. So not only will they be hiring more people, they also plan to spend more on training. And actually we had the most optimistic survey results on these two measures since 2014. So lots of room for optimism. But that was tinged a little bit of a reality check. Despite that optimism about wanting to take more people on and spend more on training, actually businesses were less confident about filling those gaps. Second, we got a good picture actually of what employers mean by the word skills. I think it's a bit of a lazy term almost. It sort of covers everything and used to capture everything. But what came really clear in the survey was three things that come under the skills umbrella that employers value. First is qualifications. There's no escape from that. Qualifications are an important part of education and skills. But just as importantly, actually, was the ability to apply that knowledge, apply those qualifications, to actually use that knowledge. And then third was behaviours and aptitudes. Not qualifications, not technical education, but actually creativity, leadership, working as a team. These things were viewed just as valuable as qualifications. And a lot of the reason for that, I imagine, actually, will be the impact of automation AI that is happening as part of the fourth industrial revolution. Actually, creativity, leadership, teamwork, these are things that are the hardest to replace by AI and automation. Third was continued frustrations, actually, with the apprenticeship levy. There was a frightening statistic in the survey. About 25% of those surveyed were actually writing off the levy as a tax and disengaged with it entirely as a skills policy. That's something that has to change. And the government, a good step forward in the budget, announced a package of approaching £700 million worth, actually, of new flexibilities, of new support for employers, and getting rid of bureaucracy and things in the way to actually try and get employers confident in the levy so it becomes much more effective. And then finally, actually was about engagement and partnerships, which David touched on in his introductory remarks. Again, there was a lot of room for optimism. There was more enthusiasm than ever from employers to get more involved in schools and colleges and universities. But most frustrating of all, despite that greater enthusiasm, the number of engagements had actually fallen. Something I think the CBI has a good role in actually trying to bring those two conflicting things together. So I'll just finish off actually by saying, responding I suppose to your comment, David, about employers needing to be in the driving seat. I'd actually probably better describe it as a partnership. and not just employers and educators. You know, this is a partnership between unions, employers, educators, policymakers, government, to try and address the skills gaps and the changing labour market. And you know, to round off with what I started with, the cost of not addressing all these challenges is just too high, and we can't not do it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. Paul, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks, David, and thanks for the opportunity to say a few words. Maybe just to start by carrying on from where your president left off, really, by paying tribute to the work that colleges do up and down the country, but in particular the 120,000 staff who work in the sector, many of whom will be union members. I mean, it's no secret, and you've been discussing it over the last few days, the pressures that the sector's been under over the last few years, cuts to funding, which in turn have had impacts on numbers of jobs, on pay and pensions, on patterns of employment and so on. But I think despite all of those pressures, it's worthwhile taking time out to celebrate the fact that over 2.2 million people are still being supported by your colleges each and every single year. At the TUC and in our unions, we're big fans of further education. We do, to borrow your strapline, love our colleges. And we love them because they play a really important part in terms of making sure we've got the right sort of economy and the right sort of skills in the economy, because they also make a big difference to individuals and to working people generally, and giving people often that second chance to move on and to progress in their, not just their career, but in their lives as well. Maybe just 3 points from me, David, to kickstart the conversation in terms of skills and business. First point is this, from the TUC's point of view, there's no doubt that the UK has to raise its game on skills. We've seen some progress in recent years, but we know that there are big fundamental problems that remain. So not only do we have shortages in some of our key sort of technical and intermediate skills, we know that there are still far too many people struggling with some of those basic skills around English, around maths, increasingly digital skills. And that has an impact obviously on individuals, but it also has an impact on the economy. I can think it's a big contributor to the UK's productivity gap. And we face all of that against the backdrop of real emerging pressures. And I won't be the first person who's mentioned Brexit during the course of the last couple of days, but we don't know what the final shape of the deal will look like. That will certainly have a big impact on the UK's labour market, undoubtedly, as will automation and digitalisation, and what that will mean in terms of the impact potentially on employment and people being able to be equipped to deal with those challenges. Now, we think the government's taken a couple of steps forward in the right direction. John mentioned the apprenticeship levy. I think particularly with those flexibilities talked about in the budget, we think it's got an important role to play, as does the new National Retraining Partnership and Scheme that the CBI and the TUC are working on developing with the DFE. But I think my fundamental point would be this: if the government is serious about further education and is serious about vocational skills, then it has to be serious about funding the sector as well. And a good starting point would be reversing the cuts that we've seen over the past few years. You can't take 45% funding out of adult education and not have an impact on the service provided, and you can't take 30% out of colleges and not have an impact on the sector. So, skills can't be done on the cheap, I suppose, is what I'm saying. Second point is this, and follows on from John's remarks. I think employers have to do more to raise their game on skills. We know there are good employers out there who do invest in their staff, do invest in training and skills, but we know also that there are far too many businesses who don't really commit to developing what they regard as quite often their biggest asset, which is their staff. And I think a recent report by the IPPR found that employer investment in vocational training is around about half the EU average. We know that spending on training fell significantly after the financial crash, and we know that a third of companies provide no training at all to their staff, and that's just not good enough, and we have to address that. So I think employers have to raise their game, government has to take action to encourage them to raise their game, and not just in terms of issues around things like funding. I think it throws up big questions about the increasingly fragmented nature of employment, what that means in terms of people being able to access skills and support and so on. So that's maybe the second point. And the final point, and you're not going to be surprised that the bloke from the TUC says this, I think there's an important role for the trade union movement to play here, and my message to everybody in the room would be involve us, engage us and challenge us to play that role. I think we do some really good work in terms of things like apprenticeships, working with employers to design apprenticeship schemes, supporting people through apprenticeships. Do really good work in reaching out to some of those people who've traditionally been hard to engage in skills and training. Particular plug for the work that we've done through Union Learn. 230,000 people each year access new skills, training, development opportunities through Union Learn, supported by government, supported by employers, but quite often the people that we can't, I suppose the crucial thing and the difference that unions make is that you can't do skills to people. You have to involve them, and they want to be, have to want to be engaged. So I think unions got a really important part to play in the partnerships that have been talked about. So, investment in the sector, employers raising their game, building genuine partnerships. I think that's the three things I'd start the conversation off with.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. Cindy.
So I'd like to start by saying, actually, I think the sector already does an amazing job at supporting economic growth up and down the country. I saw real examples of excellence when I was working as part of Richard Atkin's team with the Commissioner. But actually, I've also reflected on my career, and those of you that know me know that I spent the bulk of my career working in the media industry. And I worked for big multinationals. And when I look back at those companies, many of the people who worked in them, sort of 70% of them, actually went through a college and they had a vocational pathway. And they were adding real value to their own lives, but also to the business and their local community. So I think it's really important that we don't underestimate the value that this sector already provides. And we need to shout louder about it, which is why I think the Love Our Colleges campaign is just a fantastic initiative. I think the really important point, though, in terms of economic transformation is how FE evolves and what the future is going to look like. And I think the impact of technology is significant. We all know that. We know what technology has meant for our lives now, but it's exponential, that rate of growth. And we're seeing industries transformed. And when I think about when I graduated, or when some of you graduated, roles like app developers and cloud architects and sustainability analysts and the data engineers who know what we're going to buy before we know what we're going to buy, they didn't exist. And the pace of change of those roles evolving, I think, will be even faster. So I think the really important role for FE going forward is how do we embed that culture of lifelong learning and make sure that we're able to prepare people with the right skills at the beginning, at 16 to 18, so that actually they're able to transfer and adapt and be able to have multiple careers, which I think is something that certainly the Future of Skills and Employment report talks about. I think when we look at employers and the role of employers, I think many employers do work with colleges. I think there are some barriers, and I think some of the barriers are around language. I came into education 8 years ago. It really, really is a different language. So we need to kind of think about translation. I think the other bit is bringing employers closer to understanding the design of curriculum and assessments is going to be important, and thinking about how technology can support that going forward. But I also think there's a really important role around careers advice and guidance, and actually helping to, I guess, direct our young people from very early on in terms of what's happening in the external environment. So for me, the role of FE going forward is how does it anticipate and respond, and how do all of the stakeholders, government, educators, businesses, work to make sure that actually what we're developing in our education system is preparing us for the future, us and our young people. We recently sponsored a piece of work, as I'm sure many of you are aware, a commission looking at the future of life work and sustainable learning, which Neil Carmichael chaired. And one of the things that has come out is that we're very focused on exams as a country, actually. But actually, there are different ways of measuring success. And the need to embed those soft skills that John talked about is really crucial if people are able to adapt and step on and step off throughout their working lives. What that commission does show, and actually it gets released on the 12th of December, we're hoping, is if we could get it right in terms of what the vocational landscape and skills landscape look like, and what we deliver, and that includes the funding, the design, the kind of collaboration between employers and educators, it could add 20 billion to our economy. That's just under a third of what we spend a year, or the DFE spends a year on education. So there's a big prize here, and John alluded to that, to be gained. But I do think the role around economic transformation is about the future and what are those future roles going to be and how do we prepare young people for success in their lives and careers in the future.
Thanks, Lindy. And John.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I think I'd like to kick off by mentioning a report that came out a few months ago. I think it was the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee, which looked at the world of sort of post-18 education and made quite a contrast between the fortunes of the FE sector and the fortunes of the higher education sector. And it was a damning criticism of this country's obsession with sending children to university, really stating that tens and tens of thousands of young people don't need to go to university each year. In fact, they shouldn't. It's the worst thing that could happen to them. And they leave with an average of 45 to 50,000 pounds worth of debt. And it was really castigating politicians of all parties for a miserable failure in public policy. So that really actually made an impact on me reading through that report, because very often with House of Lords reports, they're less partisan and you just get the benefit of the participants' huge experience of life. So that's one thought I'd like to leave you with. The second thought is the Conservative government are promoting something called an industrial strategy, something that you would ordinarily have expected to have been promoted by a Labour government. And hopefully that shows a future level of bipartisanship in this whole space, the bringing together of trade unions, employers and government to really get behind those sectors of the economy that will provide the jobs and the prosperity that we need. Third, we now come on to Brexit and to try and link all of these things together in terms of how it affects the hospitality industry, or hospitality and tourism. Pretty clear that Brexit, is it pretty clear that Brexit's going to happen? That freedom of movement is going to end after the end of the transitional period, but we don't know how long the transitional period is going to be for. But cutting all that out for a moment, imagining a world in which political parties operate a different immigration framework and, to cut to the chase, far fewer EU nationals coming into this country to work in industries like hospitality, tourism, food processing, etc. Now, linking the House of Lords, the industrial strategy, and the Brexit employment agenda leads us to something called sector deals, where the government is highlighting and choosing those sectors. And one of those will, we hope, be tourism. And the way I can envisage it working is that we need a relationship between the hospitality industry and the colleges really on two levels. The first level has been the long-standing and traditional level, the local partnership between a local college and local employers. It works well, it works better in some areas than in others, but it's a relationship that we all know and we all understand. What we haven't had in the past, and I think we urgently need it for the future, is to bring together the national level partnership. And one of the difficulties in hospitality and tourism has been the fact that it literally has got hundreds of thousands of businesses. It hasn't got hundreds of thousands of trade associations, perhaps tens of thousands, but it's got too many. But the idea would be that the sector deal will embrace a new way of working. And we do need the national level partnership with the colleges, because I think if the colleges were to look at it in this sense, that I think you and I, our industry, I should say, have got one thing in common. For different reasons, we don't feel that our contribution to society and the economy more broadly is sufficiently valued. You zero in on the issue about funding. I don't need to comment about your frustration over funding. And we don't feel that the value of hospitality and tourism to the economy and society is sufficiently appreciated. I think if we work together more effectively at the national level, then we might be supporting your campaign for funding indirectly, and you might be supporting our campaign for greater recognition of its economic and social contribution. So I think this new dialogue, this new way of working has been occasioned by Brexit, which is a massive rupture to our economy, the effects of which we don't fully understand and won't understand for a number of years. But I think whatever might be our views about Brexit, we do have to recognise that almost certainly it's going to happen and that it will create the need for new partnerships and a genuinely new approach to the way we work together.
Thanks, John. So thank you very much for all that. Lots and lots in there. If there are any questions from the audience, please do indicate. I just want to kind of kick off because it seems to me that one of the themes that came through quite strongly is this sense of the different opinions and views about skills and so on. And so, John, you talked about understanding what we mean by the term skills. And Cindy, you talked a bit about the language difficulties and barriers. And I just wonder if we need to start getting a bit more realism about what employers can expect from colleges and from students, and to talk a little bit more about what employers are actually looking for. Because it seems to me we've had a period, sort of an unprecedented period actually, where the labour market has been able to find people who are almost job ready, who don't need a lot of development once they join an employer, because it's been an incredibly open labour market. You know, the skills have come in and been imported, if you like. And if that's gone, you know, what is it that we should expect from colleges and from their students? I don't know, John, if you wanted to...
Yeah, I suppose the exam question of this then is what does it mean to be work ready? Which is a really hard question to answer. And you get a different answer depending on what sector you go into, what size of business, what part of the country you ask that question. And you're also right to raise the question of what's it reasonable to expect at different levels. So one of the oddities and some of the odd phrases that you hear is sort of maybe someone saying a young person at 15, 16 entering the workplace doesn't understand how an office works and they're not work ready. And you sort of think, well, they've probably not been in an office before. It's probably not reasonable to actually expect that. Actually, that is probably a reasonable expectation on the employer as part of their induction and onboarding process to explain what a photocopier is and how you work in an office. But actually at 21, when you're leaving university or any other form of training, it actually probably is more reasonable to expect you to understand how these things work. So I think there's absolutely a role, and the CBI will be working on this over the next sort of 3 or 4 months to actually try and answer that question, what does it mean to be work ready, and try and bottom it out. Because to your point as well about sort of, I mentioned creativity and leadership and teamwork, and actually those in themselves are also lazy terms, because actually to be creative in accountancy is very different to being creative in any
Colleges
other
are very good at it, actually.
Indeed.
They've had to be. But,
So actually, you know, sort of delving really deep and sort of realising it's an incredibly complex question, and then trying to sort of work out what's reasonable is incredibly important.
Cindy, do you?
I think it's interesting that more organisations and businesses are looking at aptitude rather than technical skills. So I think going back to this point about the design of curriculum and assessment and really building those skills around creativity, critical thinking. I always say that in my time at City and Islington, when I did my leaving speech, the one thing that I talked about learning was the power of enrichment. So all of those kind of activities that really help people develop, you know, how to be part of a team, how to problem solve, how to kind of have critical thinking. And I think businesses are looking at those aptitudes, and that's what they need, that's what they can mould, and particularly because jobs are changing. So, you know, and it's interesting that a photocopier might not be the norm, because what you do is you do a PDF email to yourself or whatever it is we do now. So I think it's about understanding that. I think we also need to have a think about what we mean when we describe businesses. So if you look at, I went to see Black Panther, like many people probably did at the beginning of the year, and 3,000 people worked on that film. So you had big global organizations working on it, but also SMEs and freelancers. So I also think it's about how we prepare people to work in that kind of ecosystem, and it's not the traditional sense of what a business is. The third thing I'd like to kind of comment on this bit actually is the word skills. I think we need to do a bit more myth-busting around the word skills. I think if you ask somebody what pops into their head when you ask, you know, what is a skilled worker, it'll still be the kind of hard hat, the mechanic. But actually, doctors are incredibly skilled. Care workers are incredibly skilled. So I think we need to kind of challenge what we mean by skills. And it is about those softer human kind of transferable skills that prepare people to be successful in their lives. And that also includes jobs. But I think it's complex. I don't think it's just about employers or traditional employers. We need to look beyond that.
I mean, I get a little bit frustrated when in some of these debates around sort of young people being work ready. I mean, I don't think there's ever been a generation that young people have left school or college or university and they've been work ready. And if I think back to my dad was an apprentice welder, worked in English Electric in Liverpool. You didn't turn up at work at 16 and people had expectation that you were going to be work ready. Part of your apprenticeship was not just learning the technical skill, it was learning about what it was like to be at work and what the norm was and the expectation that you were going to be there on time and so on. I think it's also important to remember that not everybody has the same personal circumstances. I've got a 20-year-old son who's in the third year of a joinery apprenticeship, and I can guarantee you every morning at 6:30 in the morning, either me or his mum are banging on the door saying, come on, you've got to get out, and he's on site at 8 o'clock in the morning. Now, there'll be other kids who are in a similar situation who haven't got the person knocking on the door making sure they're out, and it's not because he's got a better aptitude or a better personality or he's more go-getting. It's the fact he's in a set of family circumstances which mean that we're making sure he's out and he's going to work and, you know, holding him to account even before he goes out. So I do think we have to bear in mind people's personal circumstances, and I suppose then we also go back to this thing about, you know, this doesn't begin and end the moment you leave college or university or school. I mean, we know, and I think Cindy made the point, that people are going to have to develop their skills right throughout their working lives. I'm really interested in things like we've, you know, talked about things like midlife career reviews, because careers advice in this country, I think, is almost at a crisis point. But it's, what advice there is always focused on people who are leaving school, leaving college, leaving university. And actually, sometimes it's the second job or the third job, or you get to your mid-20s or your early 30s and you think, maybe I'll do something else. And it's no use your college is providing those potential opportunities for people to retrain and skill if there's nobody signposting and supporting people to take advantage of those opportunities.
So John, you talked a bit about the perceptions of all of this, and I think it's really important. I remember sitting at dinner quite a few years ago next to the a managing director of one of the British Telecom big business units, and it was a minister. I can't remember which minister it was. We've had so many over the years, and we were sitting there, and the minister was asking all these business leaders what they thought of apprenticeships and skills, and this guy said, well, you know, Minister, what we have to do is we have to bring back apprenticeships because it's appalling that there are no apprenticeships in this country. The night before, I'd been sitting on the British Telecom table at the National Apprenticeship Awards dinner when they won Large Employer Apprenticeship Employer of the Year. So from BT, from BT, the one guy who was very senior didn't believe they were doing it. I think they had about 2,000 apprenticeships. You know, there's something for me about how we turn this around. So we keep talking about the problems as if the glass is half empty. What can we do to turn it around to start talking about the good things that are happening? You know, the hundreds and thousands of examples that there are, the good employers that are investing, and try and talk it up a bit more, and perhaps do that in the hospitality industry.
It's about 18 months ago, I found myself in front of one of the select committees looking at Brexit. And I think I startled the people in the room when I said, look, the fact is we have got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young people working in our industry that are fantastic. That's the truth. We couldn't function as an industry without them. It was only 5 years ago, now 6 years ago, that this country showcased to the world what a fantastic country we are when it comes to hospitality. It was called the Olympics. I mean, it was absolutely, fantastic in terms of the hospitality we displayed to the world, and it was done overwhelmingly by British people, of which young people were the majority. So we've got to recognise, I think, our great strengths. The problem that I think needs to be overcome, if you put aside the lack of bipartisanship in the space of vocational education, I mean, it's no accident that continental European countries don't have a problem with hospitality recruitment. They don't have a problem in Germany or Austria or Switzerland, for example. And the reason is that there's been a bipartisan approach to vocational education in those societies for decades. And hospitality in Germany and Austria is seen as a profession. And that's something that we want to get to. I think for industry, industrial leaders, one of the problems is that because of the government's own bias over decades, A-levels in university, they can understand. And let's face it, most managing directors and owners of capital have children who take A-levels and go to university. And the vocational space, which you think ought to be simpler, is just the most horrendous mix of acronyms and confusion and different funding rules and formula and layouts and progression paths and journeys and opportunities and lifelong and adult and flexible. It's just amazingly complex to distill into an understandable form. The two things that I think need to be our key watchwords is that there's a fundamental difference between skill and attitude. And attitude is not just down to the college, it's the person's experience of life, their upbringing, the environment they live in, their experience at school, college, and the workplace. Skill can be more accurately defined, but attitude is something that comes with the right attitude from lots of other people.
Paul?
Yeah, just to pick up actually a couple of points, John, of one, it's not just most business leaders who are sending their kids through A-levels and universities. It's the same for a lot of our politicians as well, which is, I think, sometimes why FE falls right down the education sort of radar, if you like. But really interesting your point, John, about the potential of the industrial strategy and sector councils and the sector deals, because here is an opportunity, isn't it, to try and join up government policy. So you've got a commitment to support for sector councils and sector deals, the apprenticeship levy, the potential around sort of thinking about T-levels, your sector in particular. And I think if you can bring together those partnerships, which is like, can we agree in hospitality, in retail, in private social care, the need for us to drive up employment standards, the need for us to drive up productivity, to give people new opportunities. Exactly that sort of partnership approach that John was describing, I think, is really important. It will require investment, and one of the frustrations for me, I think it's great that the government's industrial strategy will support investment in research and development in life sciences and in aerospace. Rightly, it should. But where's the investment in sector like hospitality, where it might not be investment in R&D, but it is about investment in people, because that's what's going to drive real improvements in that industry, make it a destination of choice for young people, and make it seen as a profession and the potential for career progression.
So a quick comment, Cindy, and then John.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Love Our Colleges, I kind of mentioned it earlier, is a great initiative. I think we need to increasingly get employers to talk about the value of people who are working in their organisations to them, and speak up and be the voice of vocational education. I also think we need to kind of challenge what we mean by vocational education. So I'm one of those accountants. I trained as an accountant. And accountancy is a vocation, as is being a doctor. So I think we need to start almost using the language across different professions and start breaking down the barriers, because actually it's not about the word vocational. Ultimately, it becomes about social economic background and class, and we need to challenge that. And I think employers can play a really key role in advocating and championing the people in their organisations who went through colleges, making huge contributions and are succeeding, because because I think that's the voice that will be heard the most, and the kind of economic impact that this sector has.
John, just a quick word.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like all the pieces of the puzzle are there. You have enthusiastic employers, as I mentioned earlier, as part of our survey results, who want to get more involved in education and see it as a priority. Business spends about £44 billion a year on education and training. It's more than the DfE spends on schools. But actually breaking down those barriers that you mentioned is so important. Another barrier that I would think is sort of artificial is actually FE and HE. You know, a lot of colleges, and I'm sure David will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 10% of HE is delivered in colleges. And universities deliver skills and further education. I mean, becoming a doctor, if you look at what a doctor degree it looks like, it's actually really an apprenticeship. It's on-the-job training, and it's technical. So these barriers are artificial. So you've got employers spending money, you have enthusiasm, you have a government that says that it completely backs skills and education is up for it, and you have world-class universities and colleges. But I think the one thing that's missing is coherence. Actually, at 14, it is possible as a young person to start going off into a UTC, so university, technical college, and start to involve more specialisation into more technical vocational education. And yet, if you ask someone at that age, how do you get to a level 8 technical qualification, even if they talk to their parents and their careers advisor, they probably wouldn't know. And yet they would probably be able to describe to you how they get to a PhD. Because it's so ingrained. Everyone knows you do GCSEs, A-levels, masters, bachelor's, PhD, whatever. So trying to bring that coherence and the bridges and ladders that actually create a system where you can do academic and technical. You don't have to choose. And that if you start down a technical route, you think, actually, this is not for me, you can go back and do an academic qualification. So the first step for me in bringing that coherence, and Paul mentioned it already, is T-levels. To actually create that level 3 equivalent to A-levels that's technical, high quality, prestigious, that parents, employers, whoever actually wants people to go for, and it's a credible qualification is so important, given it gives a pedestal to BTECs and MVQs or whatever they may be, but it brings that coherence. And once you've got the level 3, you can then start bringing coherence to the next steps and work your way up.
So we've run out of time. We all agree on one thing. The government needs to invest more in skills. You're our partners in this. We need your help. We've got college leaders here who would love you to say what you're going to do to help us win some money in the CSR. Not for them, actually, but for the work they do to support people to get the jobs and the skills and so on. So 20 seconds each only. What would you do to help us, Paul?
I mean, I think we'll carry on making the case for investment in further education. And, you know, it's not going to surprise you to say, I think there's a particular issue about staff pay and about attracting the right people into the sector and then getting them to stay. I mean, I said to you, David, beforehand, I mean, going back to my son's example, you can work more, you can earn more on a building site as a joiner than you can teaching a joinery course at a local college. And you've got to make colleges attractive places to work, that people get a sense that they're valued and rewarded. Pay is one part of that. It's not the only part of that, but I think love our colleges, but love our staff in the colleges who are delivering the service.
Thank you, John. 20 seconds only.
The most frustrating part of my job is going into colleges, schools, universities and saying, I can't get to talk to employers, they won't listen to me. And then having the same conversation with employers, say, I've approached a school or college, university, and they've ignored me. So I think for me, actually the CBI in the middle, as a brokerage, trying to make these two groups talk and achieve the same thing.
Brilliant. Cindy?
I think it's working with employers and educators to make sure that we've got the right content assessment and that we're evolving it so that it's relevant for the future. And that, for me, includes supporting an academic pathway and the T-levels, but also recognising the huge benefit from existing qualifications at the moment, including applied generals.
Thank you. And John, final words. 20 seconds.
I'd like the government to outline an absolutely compellingly clear vocational pathway, and I'd like somebody in the government to explain to me exactly how T-levels and apprenticeships sit alongside each other. That's number one. And number two, I would like the industry to recognise that the hospitality and tourism succeeds in local areas. That could be a city, it could be a coastal community, but every single local area will be serviced by an FE college, and we have to build that partnership at local level.
Super. Thank you very much. Can we say thank you to the panel?